Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. My name is Eric, and we're here to talk about unconventional commander decks. So I've been wanting to build a Voltron deck for a while. A deck with some amount of inevitability. A deck that gets stronger and stronger as the game goes on. And I wanted to play green since I don't do that nearly enough. So I thought, let's just do all three of these things at once. Let's play with Skullbriar, the Walking Grave. Skullbriar is a 1/1 zombie elemental with haste that costs green-black. That's right, a mana value of just 2, and this is a pretty good start. Whenever Skullbriar deals combat damage to a player, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. And, the most important line of text, counters remain on Skullbriar as it moves to any zone other than a player's hand or library. So again, Skullbriar's last ability is what really makes it unique. Your goal is to frantically put as many +1/+1 counters on Skullbriar as you can, as fast as you can. Don't worry if it dies because it'll keep those counters the next time you cast it. And with the release of Ikoria in 2020, now you can add ability counters to Skullbriar too, so it'll permanently have Trample or Lifelink or whatnot. And combined with its really low mana value and your access to efficient ramp in green, you can cast Skullbriar many times in a single game. And because it'll get bigger and bigger over time, it can be hard for your opponents to deal with Skullbriar permanently. So that said, there is a lot that Skullbriar does that's pretty straightforward. We'll make it big, make it evasive, and smack our opponents for lethal commander damage. But there's also a few areas where I've made some tweaks to the conventional Skullbriar deck design to make it play just a bit differently. So let's go over the contents of this deck, starting with powering up Skullbriar. So we want this deck to be inevitable. We want our opponents to feel just a little bit more despair for each and every counter we put on Skullbriar. Slowly, counter by counter. So we've got effects that provide slow, steady counters, and a few explosive effects that generate a bunch of counters at once, for good measure. Hardened Scales, Winding Constrictor, Branching Evolution, these don't add counters to our creatures directly, but they amplify the effects of any other counter-generating effects that we do apply. There's several effects like these in all of Magic, and you don't need to run all of them here. I've chosen these three because they're relatively affordable, both in terms of mana cost and real currency. Ring of Colonia and Ring of Zathrid give Skullbriar a +1/+1 counter during your upkeep, while also providing Trample or Regenerate. Evolutionary Escalation is a nice, efficient counter generator. It's a 2-mana enchantment that lets you put 3 +1/+1 counters on a creature you control at the beginning of your upkeep. But you also have to put 3 +1/+1 counters on target creature an opponent controls. We'll put those counters to much better use than our opponents will most of the time, so I think it's worth the drawback for this really efficient rate. Another somewhat risky counter generator is Unspeakable Symbol. This is another enchantment, it costs 1 black, and it lets you pay 3 life to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. This ability doesn't cost any mana to activate, so you can put +1/+1 counters on your creatures whenever you want, limited only by your life total. Go nuts. Solidarity of Heroes, Invigorating Surge, and Fractal Harness. These are our explosive counter generators. Solidarity of Heroes and Invigorating Surge are instants that double the number of counters on a target creature. This is great because these will let us catch our opponents off guard. Solidarity of Heroes also has Strive, so we can target additional creatures by paying 1 and a green extra mana for each one. And we do have other creatures in this deck that get value from +1/+1 counters, so that's a nice added bonus. Fractal Harness is an equipment that costs X, 2, and green, and when it enters the battlefield you make a 0/0 fractal token with X +1/+1 counters on it. But usually when I'm playing this, X is 0, because Fractal Harness is for Skullbriar. Anyways, Fractal Harness equips for 2, and when the equipped creature attacks, you double the number of +1/+1 counters on it. Now, this might not be an instant speed effect, like the other ones we just discussed, but it is repeatable, and that's worth quite a bit to us too. +1/+1 counters on the lands are really awesome as well. Hall of Oracles lets you pay 1 and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, but you can only do this if you've cast an instant or sorcery this turn, and you can only activate this ability at sorcery speed. We have 11 sorceries and 25 instants in this deck, because I like to respond to things, but we'll talk more about those later. So anyways, we'll have no problem activating Hall of Oracles. Llanowar Reborn and Vastwood Fortification are single-use counter generators, but again they're on land, so the cost to include them is pretty minimal. We have other ways to generate +1/+1 counters too. as well as those keyword ability counters that we talked about earlier. Let's go over those next. Now with just +1/+1 counters, Skullbriar is a big, vanilla hasty guy, and that's not very impressive in Commander. Let's give it some abilities. Trample is probably the easiest form of evasion that we can grant using keyword ability counters that are available in black and green. So we've got several sources of trample. A fully grown Hornbash Mentor and Titanoth Rex all let us put a trample counter on Skullbriar that will again be nearly impossible for our opponents to remove. Hornbash Mentor can also put +1/+1 counters on our creatures with trample for a fairly steep price of paying 2 and a green and tapping it. But we do have other forms of trample as well. We already mentioned Ring of Colonia, but we'll also use Forebear's Blade and Haunted Cloak. These are equipment that grant trample, and they also grant vigilance. I find vigilance to actually be really important in decks where you want to attack but don't have a lot of creatures, so that you can survive if your opponents counterattack. Speaking of vigilance, we do have other ways of giving Skullbriar vigilance to discourage our opponents from swinging back at us. Well, sort of. There aren't any cards that grant vigilance counters in black and green, but we do have other options. Burst of Strength, Stony Strength, and Sudden Spinnerets are all really efficient instants that just cost a single mana. Burst of Strength and Stony Strength let you untap target creature and put a +1/+1 counter on it. Now again, these are only single-use effects, but I really like these. First, they're instant speed, so our opponents likely won't expect them. Each of these cards sees play in fewer than 1,000 decks on EDHREC, and fewer than 4% of Skullbriar decks. And these cards let Skullbriar eat attackers when our opponents mistakenly make attacks that they thought were safe. So this can be better than Vigilance because it's sort of like Vigilance plus Removal combined into one. And giving an extra +1/+1 counter really pushes up the value of these spells. Sudden Spinnerets is another instant, and it untaps a creature, gives it +1/+3 until end of turn, and gives it a reach counter, so now Skullbriar can eat flyers by surprise too. We can also give Skullbriar lifelink, which is also actually pretty important since we want to attack with Skullbriar every single turn, so we won't really have too many blockers to absorb attacks coming back at us, so that lifelink will help protect our life total. Unexpected Fangs, Duskfang Mentor, and Unbreakable Bond all let us put a lifelink counter on Skullbriar. Duskfang Mentor, just like the Hornbash Mentor, can also give Skullbriar more counters once it's given a lifelink counter to it by paying 1 into black and tapping it. And Unbreakable Bond is a 5-mana sorcery that lets you return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a lifelink counter on it. Let's face it, our opponents will be highly incentivized to kill Skullbriar repeatedly, especially as the game goes on and it gets bigger and bigger. We'll need some sort of recursion, and Unbreakable Bond fits that role perfectly. But we do have a few other recursion cards that we can use as well. But only a few. Be aware of any recursion that puts a creature card from your graveyard into your hand, because if you use these on Skullbriar, it'll lose all of its counters, since it doesn't retain counters when it goes into your hand or library. So we'll use Animate Dead, which is a simple 2-mana enchantment that lets us reanimate any creature from any graveyard. We can use this on Skullbriar, or on our opponent's dead creatures too. Call of the Death Dweller was made for Skullbriar. This is a sorcery that costs 2 and a black, and it lets you return up to 2 target creature cards with total mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. You get to put a Death Touch counter on either of them, and then you get to put a Menace counter on either of them. Now Death Touch isn't that great for Skullbriar, since if we're doing our job well, it'll always be big enough to kill whatever it touches. On the other hand, if it also has Trample, it really will help Skullbriar push damage through, so the Death Touch can be useful in some circumstances. A Menace is nice, but Trample is also generally a much better form of evasion in this deck. Nonetheless, Call of the Death Dweller gives free permanent counters and recurs our commanders, so we'll take it. And lastly, I want to mention Myth Unbound. This is an enchantment that costs 2 and a green, and it says your commander costs 1 less to cast for each time it's been cast from the command zone this game. And whenever your commander is put into the command zone from anywhere, you draw a card. Now, Myth Unbound is probably best in decks where you're going to be intentionally sacrificing or killing your commander. A lot. We actually will sacrifice Skullbriar for value in this deck, sometimes, but we'll get into that later. But most of the time we don't want Skullbriar to die. Our opponents, however, very much do, and so it will, at least periodically. Myth Unbound will make our commander much more recursive, effectively cutting the commander text in half and giving us some card draw whenever we send it to the command zone. And finally, we can give our commander a few other keyword counters that help protect it. Slippery Bogbonder lets you put a hexproof counter on target creature when it enters the battlefield, and it has flash, so that's nice. Daring Fiendbonder is another creature, and you can pay 1 and a black and exile it from your graveyard to put an indestructible counter on target creature. You can activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. Now, giving our commander hexproof or indestructible permanently is amazing, and your opponents will hate you for it. You can even put a lot of tutors in this deck to help you find Slippery Bogbonder and Daring Fiendbonder, because reliably making Skullbriar hexproof and or indestructible will really turn your deck's inevitability up to 11. I would be remiss not to mention Gerard's Orders, which accomplishes this perfectly. This is a 4-mana sorcery that lets you search your library for 2 creature cards. You put one into your hand and the other into your graveyard. So you can easily get your Slippery Bogbonder into your hand and put your Daring Fiendbonder into your graveyard, which is exactly where it belongs. Now, I didn't put any creature tutors in this deck, just to power it down a little bit, but with all of these creatures that grant keyword ability counters, you could definitely add them if you want to make this deck as competitive as possible. Gerard's Orders may be a really synergistic one, but there are plenty of other creature tutors you could use because you have access to green. Finally, when it comes to protection, we'll also use Feign Death and Snakeskin Veil. These are more of those really efficient 1-mana instants that put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature, and they also protect it. Snakeskin Veil gives the creature hexproof until end of turn, and Feign Death lets you return it to the battlefield tapped with an additional +1/+1 counter on it the next time it dies this turn. Both of these will really help ensure that Skullbriar either doesn't die, or at the very least doesn't stay dead, which is exactly what we want and what we would expect from a skeleton zombie looking thing. And then there's Tyrite Sanctum, which can also give Skullbriar both +1/+1 counters and an indestructible counter, and it's a land. But outside of threatening commander damage, we've got a few other ways to take advantage of having Skullbriar loaded up with counters. Let's talk about those next. Now, Skullbriar can get quite large, and we can use a high power and toughness to our advantage. And since Skullbriar retains its counters, we can potentially do this repeatedly. First, let's talk about card advantage. Now, Return of the Wildspeaker and Rishkar's Expertise are obvious card draw spells for a Skullbriar deck, since we'll get to draw cards equal to its power. But we can also use Momentous Fall, which is a 4-mana instant that lets us sacrifice a creature and draw cards equal to its power, then gain life equal to its toughness. And that kind of value is definitely worth paying an extra 2 commander tax for. Hunter's Insight also lets us draw cards based on Skullbriar's power, but we'll need to get in for combat damage to a player first. Fortunately, it's an instant, so we can wait until the very last possible second, when we're reasonably confident that Skullbriar will get to do that combat damage before we cast this. But we can also make tokens with a large Skullbriar. Tend the Pests is a 2-mana instant that lets you sacrifice a creature to make a number of 1/1 pest creature tokens equal to that creature's power. And those pests gain you 1 life whenever they die. Now, this can gum up the board with a bunch of blockers to buy you some more time to grow your Skullbriar. And then there's Ghoul Caller Gisa, which lets you pay black and tap it and sacrifice a creature to make X 2/2 zombie creature tokens, where X is the sacrificed creature's power. Gisa is a 3/4 human wizard that costs 3 black, so while it's more expensive and slower than Tend the Pests, it's also repeatable. And remember, you can always sack Skullbriar to Gisa and then recast it and do it again, well, once Gisa untaps anyways. And Skullbriar will be just as big as it was the first time, so you can make an unreasonable amount of zombies in just a few turns. You'll also notice that things like Momentous Fall, Tend the Pests, Ghoul Caller Gisa, these are sacrifice outlets. And I want a few of those, because Skullbriar is pretty resilient, but it does have its own special forms of kryptonite. First, any effect that removes abilities, like Darksteel Mutation, will allow Skullbriar to lose its counters if it goes to the graveyard or the command zone or exile when it's enchanted with something like this, or affected by something like it. The only way to protect Skullbriar from these effects is to either counterspell the offending card, good luck doing that in black and green, or sacrifice Skullbriar before the effect can resolve. Or of course you can use hexproof effects if the spell is targeted, but sometimes it's not. Secondly, be aware of effects that remove counters from permanents. There aren't too many of these, and they aren't very widely played in Commander, But just be aware that Vampire Hexmage will absolutely ruin your day if you're not ready for it. And third, we need to watch out for -1/-1 counters. I played Skullbriar against Yawgmoth Thran Physician, and it was terrifying. So Skullbriar keeps any counters that are placed on it as it changes zones, and that includes -1/-1 counters. If Skullbriar has enough -1/-1 counters on it placed on it to remove all of its +1/+1 counters, if it had any, and then has another -1/-1 counter placed on it to reduce its toughness to 0, it will die just like any other creature. But that -1/-1 counter will remain on Skullbriar, so if you try to cast it again, it'll enter the battlefield as a 1/1 with a -1/-1 counter on it, and it'll immediately die again. So that's really bad, don't let that happen. We are all in on Skullbriar in this deck, so a single -1/-1 counter early in the game will definitely stop you from playing Magic at all. And so we run a few sacrifice outlets. We'll also use Village Rites and Plumb the Forbidden as sacrifice outlets that are low mana cost and instant speed, and they also help draw us cards. And of course, high market. But we've gone off on a tangent. I think we were talking about using a giant Skullbriar to murderize our opponents outside of the combat step, not losing sleep at night wondering if our opponents will start playing Virulent Wound on turn 2 just to troll us. And so we have a few ways to weaponize Skullbriar. Ram Through is an instant that has target creature you control deal damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. If the creature you control has trample, excess damage is dealt to that creature's controller instead. While Skullbriar won't typically get nearly as big as, say, Crush the Bloodbraided, we do have several ways to give it trample in this deck, so Ram Through will give us some extra reach by letting us target a small creature an opponent controls, and then we can deal the excess damage to its controller. Rite of Consumption is a sorcery that costs 1 and a black, and it lets you sacrifice a creature as an additional cost, and then Rite of Consumption deals damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to target player, and you gain life equal to the damage dealt this way. There are a few other cards in black like this, such as Essence Harvest, which is also 2 and a black for a sorcery. It has target player lose X life and you gain X life, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. I chose Rite of Consumption instead because it's a little harder to interrupt. With something like Essence Harvest, your opponents can remove Skullbriar in response to you casting it, and then your spell does nothing. Whereas with Rite of Consumption, you're sacrificing the creature as an additional cost to cast the spell, so it will be impossible for your opponents to stop it with anything outside of a counterspell. There is also Surestrike Trident. I've mentioned this card in several decks already. If you have a high power commander, I think it's a really great way to finish games outside of the combat step. It's a 2-mana equipment and it costs 4 to equip. You can tap the equipped creature and unattach Surestrike Trident to have the creature deal damage equal to its power to target player. It's a little clunky to use since it requires 4 mana and tapping your creature each time, but it's also reusable, so this can really put an opponent on a very short clock. And lastly, we'll use Jarad, Golgari Lichlord. This zombie elf lets you pay 1 black green and sacrifice another creature to have each opponent lose life equal to the sacrificed creature's power. I really like that this drains each opponent, and it's reusable at least as many times as we can recast or recur Skullbriar. So now we have some options to help us win the game outside of the combat step. But we've been talking about Skullbriar for a while now. Let's mention some of the other synergistic cards in this deck that don't care as much about our commander. We only have 15 creatures in this deck, not counting the commander, and many of those are mainly here to help out our commander, but not all of them. As long as we're playing with +1/+1 counters, we'll use other creatures that can help us out in supporting roles and get value from those +1/+1 counters. Incubation Druid, Gyre Sage, Marwyn the Nurturer, these are all excellent creature-based mana ramp that gain value from +1/+1 counters. I really like having graveyard removal in my decks, so I've also included Scavenging Ooze. It gets +1/+1 counters, so that's all the synergy I need to include it in this deck. It's already a pretty solid card. I also like Blood Tracker, which is a 2/2 flyer for 4 mana, and you can pay black and 2 life to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then when it leaves the battlefield, you draw cards equal to the number of +1/+1 counters on it. So that's great in this deck where we can add extra counters to it with other effects. We'll also use as much removal that grants +1/+1 counters as possible. Phyrexian Scriptures is a delayed creature board wipe that first puts a +1/+1 counter on one of your creatures, then turns that creature into an artifact creature to protect it from the impending board wipe on your next turn. Ancient Animus is a fight spell that also puts a +1/+1 counter on your creature if it's legendary. Find Finality can either return up to 2 creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, again don't target Skullbriar with this, or it can put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature you control, then give all creatures -4/-4 until end of turn. And I think we've talked about pretty much everything in the deck. As usual, I haven't mentioned every card, but you can see the link to the deck list in the description for more details. For now, let's go over the deck stats and cost. Alright, deck stats. This Skullbriar the Walking Grave deck has an average mana value of 2.82. We have 15 creatures, and most of them play supporting roles. Again, Skullbriar is our plan A, and there is no plan B. We have 26 cards that put +1/+1 counters on creatures, or otherwise amplify counter generation, like Hardened Scales. And there are 10 cards that generate ability counters, like Trample or Lifelink or Indestructible. We have 9 cards that help protect or recur our commander, like Myth Unbound or Feign Death. Some of these can also be used on other creatures, but let's be honest, they're mostly for Skullbriar. And we have 2 more pieces of recursion that won't work on Skullbriar since they recur something from our graveyard to our hand, like Bala Ged Recovery. And we have 8 pieces of card draw and 10 mana ramp spells. And finally, there are 9 single target removal spells and 4 board wipes. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $114.45 on tcgplayer.com, so it's a reasonably affordable deck if you're looking to try out Skullbriar, but don't want to sink a lot of cash into it. So that is Skullbriar the Walking Grave. In my playtesting with this deck, it really does give you that feeling of inevitability. Your deck will only get stronger and stronger throughout the game, unless someone wipes out your lands or manages to land a Darksteel Mutation or something on your commander. But your opponents will want Skullbriar dead. It's definitely not at the kill-on-sight level of threat, but it's a great target for your opponents to take out when the opportunity arises. Skullbriar is a perfect example of that lesson about solving a small problem now before it becomes a big problem in the future, so that's why this deck runs so many effects that protect or recur our commander. And many of them will give Skullbriar the odd +1/+1 counter at the same time. We also have several cards that help us close out games if commander damage won't do it for us, whether that's flooding the board with tokens using something like Ghoul-Color Gisa, or draining our opponents repeatedly by sacrificing Skullbriar to Jarad. But that is the deck, and that's all I've got for you today. Innistrad Midnight Hunt spoilers have started, so we'll be covering new content from that set in the near future. Definitely let me know in the comments if there's a commander or a mechanic or a playstyle that you'd like to see a deck built around, especially an unconventional deck. And of course, if you enjoy this content, please consider liking this video and subscribing and all of that good stuff. I try to produce unusual commander decks that use existing mechanics or commanders in a novel way, and hopefully without losing too much effectiveness in the process. But that's all for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.